Afternoon, everybody. My name is Nigel Topping. I used to be somebody around here. Now I'm just a hanger-on like everybody else. And both have their pros and cons. I was the UN climate champion for COP26 and 27, and now I run an NGO called Ambition Loop with my dear friend Gonzalo Munoz, who was the Chilean champion. Welcome to this official side event on the six-letter acronym, the ABCNCD. It's actually quite a clever framing from Simon Steele on how to this next wave of nationally determined contributions can be really powerful in terms of his acronym stands for being ambitious, being broken down into the sectors and gases so they cover the whole of the economy and the whole of the problem, and then making sure they have credible regulation standards, laws and funding baked into them so that they're investable and implementable. And we're going to explore over the rest of the session how different stakeholders can and need to come together in a kind of problem-solving frame, not just public and private, but data providers, standards setters as well, and how we can leverage that collaboration to solve problems and to co-create the pathways and solutions, recognizing that we've got to get beyond the sometimes very simple finger pointing where a group of business people in one corner say like policymakers are all muppets, they just don't understand the market. And then a group of policymakers in the corner are like, if only business people understood what it's like to get elected, and then to have 99% of the incoming telling you what a bad job you're doing, and actually still try and make policy that works. And it's kind of a miracle that does happen. So we're going to hear from five leaders from leading organizations. But before we get into the panel, and you can see the panelists on the table, I'll introduce you now so we can go straight into the panel. So we've got Nikki Bartlett here, the Chief Impact Officer from CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. You normally have to be a pop star to do one of those, formerly known as. Then we've got Sergio, who's Secretary General of ISO, of course, the International Standards Organization. We've got Marina Grossi, the President of CEBDS, as we say in Brazilian Portuguese, CEBDS, which is the Brazilian chapter of the World Business Council, and of course a hugely important role as Brazil becomes the incoming president and starts to figure out how it's going to really make the impact that everyone is expecting from you, Marina. And then we have Claire O'Neill, who was my boss once.
Best thing I ever did was hire Nigel Topping, I have to say. Best decision I ever made.
So Claire, of course, former Minister of Energy and Clean Growth in the UK, but also chairs the WBCSD Advisory Board. So very strong experience across the public and the private. But to set the scene, we're going to first hear from Mike O'Sullivan, Dr. Mike O'Sullivan from the University of Exeter, to give us some of the really important scientific background in terms of the Global Carbon Budget Report, which the University of Exeter just published. So, Mike, over to you to share the findings of that report. Thank you.
Is that on now? Okay. So yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here to present the GCB report, which we published yesterday. So this is a massive report where we're kind of studying the entire carbon cycle, and I'm presenting here today. We had 119 authors produce this report from all over the world. So we had 19 countries and 86 organizations. So this is really a massive team effort. We're trying to understand the carbon cycle. So what is GCB? So what we try and do is really to quantify the anthropogenic perturbation of the carbon cycle. So in essence, this is the fossil fuel emissions, which is the leftmost arrow on this figure. So that's fossil fuel emissions to the atmosphere, and also emissions from land-use change, such as deforestation. That's the yellow arrow next to the grey one. And together, these two emissions, as I'm sure we all know, are driving the increase in atmospheric CO2. But not all of the CO2 stays in the atmosphere. About 50% does, and the rest is absorbed by the land and the oceans. That's the green arrow pointing down to the land, and the blue arrow points down to the ocean. And what we really try to do is understand each of these fluxes independently to kind of get a full picture. So key highlights for this year. So start off with fossil fuel emissions. So this is global fossil CO2 emissions the last 60 years, and as we all know, it's been increasing over time. And kind of the key highlight is that 2024 saw the highest ever fossil CO2 emissions we've ever had. So people talk about, are we peaking yet? And there's no sign of that. And we wouldn't know anyway for a couple of years, but main message is CO2 emissions are just going up and up and up. We've broken this down into emissions by sources and regions. So on the left-hand side, you've got all the sources. Again, key message here, in 2024, coal, oil, and gas all increased. So all fossil fuels are increasing, some at different rates and for different drivers and different regions. But the main message is that fossil fuel emissions are still increasing. If you look over to the right-hand side, we've got the main emitters here. So China in the orange. China saw a large growth in 2023, more muted in 2024, but we do project China to grow this year with some uncertainty. US and EU continue to decline as their decarbonisation and coal's being phased out. And then in India, as living standards are rising, the electricity demand is rising, and that's being fed by coal and somewhat renewables, but a lot of coal power as well. So that's kind of a quick overview of fossil fuel emissions, not a good story. On the land use change side, on the left-hand figure here is the net land use change emissions. So this is when you add up deforestation, reforestation, afforestation, peat drainage, wood harvest, you add everything together, you get on the left-hand side, and we have a substantial net land use flux to the atmosphere. So we've still got a lot of way to go to zero deforestation. There is some good news that this trend is declining over time. So we can see since 1990 or 2000, we've had a decline in land use emissions, and we think this trend is pretty robust now. We've got new data this year, which kind of has made this trend more robust. With a slight increase in 2024 due to forest degradation in Brazil, and we're hoping that this is just a blip and the trend will continue next year. On the right-hand side is where we break the flux down into drivers, and really the ones to concentrate on are the red line at the top and the green line at the bottom. So the red line is basically this deforestation flux, and that's the dominant flux when we think about land use change emissions. There are some removals from forest regrowth projects, and that's the green line. And kind of the key headline here is that deforestation emissions are declining over time, but the regrowth flux looks like it's stalled and it hasn't really increased at the pace we want it to. But overall, net land use fluxes are decreasing. Okay. Here I'm just showing the main emitters of land use change. So you've got 3 countries. Brazil, Indonesia, DRC contribute to 60% of the net land use flux. So there's a substantial kind of flux from the tropics. However, this is often driven by commodities in the Northern Hemisphere. So Europe, USA and China demanding products that are produced in the tropics contribute a lot to this land use flux. So there are policy levers we can pull in the north that can massively affect tropical emissions. So when we look at the total, so we add up the fossil fuel and land use change, we get this red line. So the red is the sum of the two other lines there. And we see over the last decade that total CO2 emissions have been flatlined and static. So that's, you know, if you've got a positive outlook, that's good. We've kind of hit some sort of peak, but it's nowhere near the rapid decarbonisation and reduction in fossil fuel emissions we need. We're just, the action so far has just not been adequate. What we also assess in GCB is carbon dioxide removal. So there's 2 types we kind of assess. So the left-hand side is kind of photosynthesis-driven CDR, which is kind of what we assess in that land use change flux I just presented. And this is the vast majority of CDR that we have currently. The 2 boxes on the right, the 2 figures on the right, are this novel CDR or tech-based CDR. And currently this CDR is 1 million times smaller than fossil fuel emissions. So it's 1 million times smaller. So we need to rapidly increase this flux to have any chance of hitting net zero emissions. Okay, so as I said at the start, 50% of our emissions don't remain in the atmosphere, some going to the land and the ocean. So we can also assess how they change over time. So the left-hand side is the land sink. There's high inter-annual variability due to ENSO. And on the right-hand side, you've got the ocean sink. And what we can see is that they're both increasing over time. In 2023, though, for the land, we had droughts, we had El Nino conditions, and that caused a 40% reduction in the land sink in 2023 compared to the year before. So we're seeing the impacts of droughts and climate change on the land sink, starting to decrease the ability to absorb carbon. I'm showing that here. So this is what I'm going to show on the left-hand side is the cumulative impact of climate change on land carbon uptake. And on the right-hand side, it's where that's happening. So if I go through, you can see over time, this is the cumulative impact. Okay, that hasn't worked. I'll skip that. This is the kind of full cumulative signal. So you can see for the first 50, 60 years of the century, 20th century, not much happened. And then as temperatures started to skyrocket, the land had severe less ability to absorb carbon. You see this is a massive tropical response, but also in the north across China, Europe, and the US. So we're seeing the climate change is having a massive negative impact on land carbon sink. So the summary there is novel CDR is not enough at the moment, and the land is precarious. We don't know what the land sinks are going to do in the future. So we really, really need to reduce fossil fuel emissions at source. When we look at how we're doing that, we can track our progress towards mitigation. And because we know this tight relationship between temperature change and cumulative emissions, we know what our remaining carbon budget is. So our new updates of CO2 emissions, we can estimate that there's about 230 gigatons of CO2 left for 1.5 degrees, which is about 6 years at current levels. So we've got 6 years at current levels, and then it's likely we'll hit 1.5 degrees. So we need drastic action now to really reduce this. And hopefully we can hear from the panel how we're going to get there. So that's all from me. And I don't know if it's in time for any questions or at the end. So.
Well, great, thank you, Mike. We do have time. If anyone's got a burning question for Mike, that he's just dropped a very hard data bomb on the room. There's no denying the facts, right? But anybody got any questions about the content or interpretation? Mike went through quite fast. Yes, one in the front row here. And I'll just take a couple of questions. Mike's going to be back for the Q&A at the end. So if something brews during the middle, you can go. Yes, please. If you just whoever is speaking, just briefly introduce yourself and then a succinct question. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nigel. I'm Emily Faint. I'm from the British Standards Institution, and I lead our net zero policy team. The data that you just presented is quite a bombshell. And I wonder, in terms of talking about this in terms of practical action, is your point really today that we need to ensure that we do not assume that the sinks that we are relying on will continue to exist? They may possibly fail altogether, leaving us in a place where we have only our own emissions reductions efforts to rely on if we are to reach that 1.5 goal that we're all striving towards.
Yeah. So we obviously land-based CDR is going to be important. I mean, look at the IPCC, those fluxes do exist, but the warning is if we continue in a high global warming world, the land doesn't like that. Plants don't like droughts, it's obvious, right? So the land sink will weaken. And in the flip side, if we do have a high mitigation world, CO2 in the atmosphere won't increase anymore, and the land sink will disappear, because that land sink is a function of atmospheric CO2. So in both states, the chances are we're going to have a reduced land sink. Obviously, you can have good management of your land, and that can in itself create a land sink, but we don't know how the natural world is going to respond. So it's an incredibly risky bet to have your NDCs or have your targets based on a land sink. We don't know what's going to happen. And we're seeing droughts and more extreme events every year. Look at Canada last year. Look at Brazil right now. The last few months, Brazil's been on fire. So we don't know what's going to happen. So I think there is a place for the land, but it's not a substitute for fossil emissions. And I can't stress that enough.
One more question, we'll move to the panel over there.
Thank you. My name is Mike Rossi. I'm the Director of Standardization at the ISO Central Secretariat. Thank you for this fantastic presentation. I'm an engineer, so I love data, and the more factual, the better. At the beginning of the presentation, you show that the US and Europe are decreasing their emissions, except these are direct emissions, aka Scope 1 and 2. It would be nice to represent the Scope 3. And then everything changed, because what is produced in China is consumed in Europe and the US. Thank you.
Yeah, so we do, I didn't present it here, so we do assess territorial versus consumption emissions. And you're right, US and Europe emissions would be higher, but those trends, you see it in both cases. So the consumption emission isn't changing over time that much. So if you look at, if I plotted European and US trends, they'd be declining still, but they would be just higher, but it's kind of a static shift. Yeah.
Great, thank you much. Great questions. Thank you, Mike. We'll see you back later. And that of course, that challenge of presenting country data on Scope 1 and 2 is partly an artifact of the way that UNFCCC asks countries to set targets and report. But in the UK's case, of course, the Climate Change Committee does analysis and sets targets on both the to meet the UNFCCC requirements and to make sure we're not letting ourselves off the hook in terms of consumption. So let's get into the panel then. So Mike's laid out very clearly why we need very high levels of ambition, and the UK has just laid out very ambitious NDC. But what we really want to get into is how do you turn that kind of high level ambition? I mean, 81% sounds great, but in order for that to be implemented in the real world, a lot more needs to happen. So to start with, I just want very quickly kind of a 1 minute introduction. Each of you just say a little bit about the way that your work is addressing that issue and just to give the audience a bit of a sense for the sort of cross-sectoral nature of all the work that needs to happen. So let's just start with Nikki to say a little bit about the role of data and reporting.
Sure, thank you, Nigel. So very briefly, CDP, a global environmental disclosure system, over 2/3 of global market cap disclosed through us, as well as 1,200 cities, states and regions. I think that for us, data is the cornerstone of being able to track NDCs and tracking progress. And the only way you're going to have a whole of economy approach is to be able to utilize this data. And I've got a few numbers that will match in terms of the trillions that really kind of speak to those slides, but I'll leave that for the next bit.
Thank you. Sergio, just briefly, the role of standards in enhancing accountability and credibility.
Yeah, thank you. Well, standards are globally relevant solutions to address global challenges, in this case, a global crisis, let's say. And the key question is whose responsibility it is. So governments, private sector, consumers, and I think it's all of them, but when you say all of them, at the same time, you're saying no one wants. So what we really need is a multi-stakeholder platform, and this is what ISO can do. We bring together at the national level all those stakeholders to agree, and then we go to the international level to have a second layer of consensus. So this is the only way, I think, to ensure consistency and interoperability.
So the way that the standards are produced is as important as the content of the standard in a way. Great, thank you.
Yeah, and it's not a nice to have; it's a requirement.
Yeah, then we'll come back to that. But it's not built into the way that all standards are made from other people. So that we'll go into that in more detail in a minute. Marina, in the spotlight, Brazil. I think my assessment would be that very low expectations from Azerbaijan, therefore a chance to over-deliver. Very high expectations from Brazil, so a lot of pressure. And I know you guys are up for it, but just say a little bit about what the main sectoral challenges are facing Brazil and how just a little bit about how you approach addressing those main sectoral challenges in a very different economy from say the country that I come from.
Thank you, Nigel. Thank you all. Well, that's true. I think there's a lot of pressure, especially because Brazil is the one that can keeps the 1.5 alive. We, as you see, we have most of our emissions comes from land use and land use change. Is the opposite of the whole world. But we can deliver our NDC, we can deliver 1.5 alive. So I think that's important. It's I think for a long period of time, the first country, a democratic country, the ones that has a lot of possibilities, but also the ones that has the country that has to be recognized by the great biodiversity and the great solutions that we have. So there is a lot of pressure, and that's why we are working together with the government. So side by side with the government to see, we just deliver our NDC. We are making a lot of suggestions in Climate Week, during the Climate Week, the last one. We had a statement from more than 50 companies, big companies that we have 120 big companies, and saying that we want investable NDC, that we want something that we can really attract investment for Brazil. So that's an important thing. We just deliver our NDC. That was the first, the second one that was delivered here. That shows ambition. And I think that's the COP for ambition. We have to deliver that. So and also finance. So the pressure for Brazil will be a little bit less. So I hope we can deliver some of those issues here.
Great, thank you, Marion. And we'll get in a bit more detail later about some of the progress in actually driving investment into some of those sectors that are particularly important for the Brazilian economy. Claire, you got unique insight on both sides of the public-private divide. Just give us a sense of maybe the importance and the challenges of getting policymakers and businesses to talk a common language.
Thanks, Nigel, and so great to be here. By the way, I think this is going to be a good COP. I just want to slightly defend. I think this is an extremely well organised COP. I think the breakthrough on Article 6 will be monumental in the carbon markets, and I still have high expectations for this COP. I think they have done a good job hosting us. But I also think that NGCs have been on an evolution. So you will all remember that initially they were kind of coughed up in short order, and in some cases were literally a couple of pages of sort of wishes and hopes that were produced probably by an official in the Department of Ecology, and certainly weren't a whole of government, let alone a whole of economy plan for decarbonisation. And of course they have the long-term strategies attached to them, which again were not really very implementable or detailed. And I think we're absolutely on an evolution now. And I think what we're starting to see is the realization that NDCs are not just something you serve up to get the COP ecosystem off your back. They're actually an incredibly important dynamic document for long-term decarbonisation of your economy. And the better the inputs, the more likely you are to deliver them. And of course, you have the opportunity now in an NDC to be very clear about your conditionality. And yes, there is a lot of conditionality around carbon removal, whether it's through engineered or land-based sinks. And I think your presentation is brilliant for pointing out that that's certainly not a done deal. But there are a lot of conditionalities around finance, around technology sharing. And actually, I remember this from the UK as well, that, we absolutely, as we evolve that process, Nigel, you'll remember our clean growth strategy that I kind of led in 2020, whatever it was, 17, 18. That was really a whole of economy document. How could you set a whole of economy document without talking to your businesses, without talking to your entrepreneurs, without talking to NGOs and academia? And I think those processes now are becoming much more established, and we are starting to see kind of best case examples of NDCs coming forward. And of course, we have the NDC partnership, who I think are doing a brilliant job, capacity building, showing countries that this isn't just doing your homework for COP. This is actually creating something that really gets political alignment once, but also then sets forward an action plan for delivery. So I think that move to a really valuable whole of economy document, planning and tracking document, is super important.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Claire. I may ask you to embellish on that, because one of the questions I have in my mind is, are we expecting too much of NDCs? So the NDC is an artifact of the UNFCCC process, and the obsession with that as the focal point of policy may not meet the national circumstances in all cases. But
can I say something, if you may? No, you're going to come back.
I'm going to come back to you. Otherwise, you and I are going to have a long conversation and annoy everyone in the middle. So look, for very different perspectives, and I want to dive a bit deeper. Nikki, to start with you, obviously CDP close to my heart, spent quite a time working with you there, super important organisation. But let's talk a little bit about how data and what quality of data really drives ambition. Because one of my observations is that it's also often very easy for people to say, we'll get ambitious when the data improves. So maybe you could just unpick a little bit about which data, what quality and how, and just deal with that issue of when is there enough data and when is it good enough quality to move?
So I think, first of all, we have the data we need, right? Data is not supposed to be something that's perfect and that tells you something, the perfect number. That's not its aim. Its aim is to tell you where to focus. So it is a heat map. Right? It shows you relatively where your stresses are, whether you're a company, whether you're a city, whether you're a state, whether you're a government, right? So that's the first thing to say. We have enough data for that. And secondly, data needs to be used to drive action, right? Data on its own with all the AI out there is completely irrelevant if it's not used to change decisions. So that's been my kind of two key points. And I don't think we should, CDP has shown for the last 23 years that data quality is growing. We have, when folks say to us, what about SMEs? When developing countries, actually our biggest disclosing region is Asia now, right? Ahead of the United States. So, and SMEs, 12,500 in 1 year, right? So they are on this journey, the data's coming through, it is being used and it's embedded into financial decision making, it's embedded to procurement decisions, it's actually being used by governments. And I have a great example of the Brazilian government using CDP's data actually directly into their decision making and into their NDCs. But we'll come back to that later. I just want to run through 3 numbers given the presentation we've just had on fossil fuels, which was a little bit sobering, to be honest. So I'm sure many of you saw the IMF published a report about 5 trillion on average needed a year, right, for us to achieve our targets by 2030. Grantham Institute this morning published one, 6.5 on average, right? So we're in the 5 to 6 trillion number. At the same time, in the disclosure numbers the data we've just pulled through from companies, there is a number for the globe. So the 500 biggest companies, interestingly, report the potential opportunity for 5 trillion, same number in opportunities in the transition. But of course, those are across longer periods, shorter periods, depending on the whole of economy approach that governments take, the regulation that's behind it, right? But then on the other hand, to kind of back that stat, you've got trillions. Just 500 companies last year, 575 financial institutions reported to us last year, half of them reported having 9 trillion in fossil fuel financing across their portfolios. That's equivalent to the combined GDP of Japan and Germany together, right? And if you just think of those graphs. So it's a stark, you've got this opportunity, and then you've got 9 trillion invested in the finance sector. Now, the finance sector is going to be key to us actually unlocking the finance, especially at this finance COP. I really want to see that come in, the mobilization of that finance. But we need the whole of economy approach, because without that regulation, the plan that covers the whole economy, that number in the finance sector portfolios is going to sit there. It could even grow, because clearly the money is going to go where there are still opportunities. And we need to make sure that the opportunities are going in that 6 trillion direction for climate, and not for the fossil fuels.
Right, thanks, Nikki. And there's a direct link actually, Sergio, to the question I want to ask you about standards, because it seems to be part of your key, as you say, embedded in your definition of a standard is the international and the multi-stakeholder process for arriving at a standard. And something I found out recently from Mark Campanale, who's of course the founder of Carbon Tracker, who's for a long time been doing very high quality research, basically asking the question is, how can we have billions of barrels of oil of unburnable carbon, the so-called carbon bubble, on the balance sheets of companies and not drive a correction in valuation? And he's doing some work now in consultation with the UK government, which looks at the standard for valuing the reserves of listed oil and gas companies. Turns out the standard was written by the Institute of Petroleum Engineers a long time ago. And it served very well, right? And I'm not saying that was nefarious. It's just a long time ago. And now, if what's built into that standard is the assumption that if you've got a barrel of oil, then you're going to be able to burn it. That's clearly out of kilter with the fact that we've got way more barrels of oil on the listed reserves than Mike's shown budget available, even 1.5, 1.7 or 2 degrees. So just tell us a little bit more. I think it's really important about the process of making standards, and maybe just colour that with why that works and more kind of single stakeholder standards are less robust and less helpful.
All right. So the first thing to say is that standards sit in a much bigger ecosystem, which is the national quality infrastructure. And this is very important because it includes standardization, the language you create, then metrology, how you measure, and finally conformity assessment, which is your way to verify and to provide credibility to everything you do. So that's number one. Number two, about standards, because it's true when you say these are universally agreed, number one, and then accepted best practice. And there are two elements there. The first is due process and then values. Because it's not only the content. I can give you a new standards in a couple of weeks. I bring top expert to my office in Geneva and I give you the standard. But that is not what we believe in, and those are not the values we follow. So first of all, we believe in decision-making by consensus, painful sometimes, I know, but very essential in terms of getting traction and credibility. Then inclusivity, to bring to the table everybody, even those who disagree with you. Transparency, and then the key element of giving a voice to developing countries, because this cannot be a top-down conversation from big countries imposing something to developing and less developed countries. And this is very concrete. We have 172 members. In each country, the government designate a national standard body, and we make sure that all of them have the same capacity to participate, not only opening a door, also providing an enabler, a concrete enabler for those developing countries to have a voice and to be part of this consensus building. At the end of the day, through a standard, we define what we want, and as you participated, you launched actually our net zero guidance 2 years ago in Sharm el-Sheikh. What is it what we need when we say net zero? Very, very important. We define the way to measure, to verify, and then to report back. And this is at the end of the day what we need to do with our NDCs.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to come back in a minute to the role of standards in driving international policy alignment, because it seems to me that's one of the barriers potentially to business ambition. But let's go back and take a slightly deeper dive into Brazil, and just again. Just give us a sense, because it seems to me like we've had several NDCs announced, and the UK's NDC has actually just been the headline target. It's slightly a function of the advisory machinery, and the Climate Change Committee will give full advice for the 7th carbon budget in February, and I think the UK will then they'll add the B and the C, I hope, to their ABC. It's really just an A at the moment, but Brazil's actually gone further already. So maybe tell us a few things that you've learned about the nature of that. How to build trust between the private sector and the public sector when trying to raise ambition and avoid the fears of policy capture, and the importance of, I think, building empathy between two crucial stakeholders with very different challenges to moving forward. So a little bit about the actual sort of human process that has underpinned that Brazilian NDC.
Well, I think that's also unique in what we are having in Brazil, because there is a lot of consensus between public sector and private sector. For instance, sustainability is part of the agenda of 19 ministers in Brazil. So it's an important issue for Brazil. And that makes easier for us from private sector that advocates this since the beginning. BCSD Brazil has 27 years now, and it's always talking about climate change and biodiversity and the comparative advantage that Brazil has in this agenda. So I think, and we are delivering, we have our Green Deal, it's calling the transformation ecological plan. We have a lot of measures going on. For instance, we just voting now the regulatory carbon market. That's an important issue for BCSD Brazil since 2016, and finally, I think we're going to deliver that. So there is a lot of discussions between private sector and public sector. I think that helps a lot, and also the science, because we are talking about 2050, and I think the data from the global carbon budget shows that we have to act before that. And if you think about the forests in Brazil, maybe we can reach the tipping point in 13 years in the Amazon biome. So we have to have a lot of efforts on this, but also it's not depending only on us, but we also have to make an effort to be investable. We need resources that comes from abroad. We need to sell carbon credit. We need to be the payment for ecosystems, something that really happens. So that's why you have also the finance sector in BCSD Brazil discussing how can we scale things like blended finance, change the metrics of risk from the financial area. That's something that we have to speed it up, all those measures. And from our side, we are also trying to have more bold corporate transition targets to align with the government. So I think that's especially in some areas like land use and land use change, and the big challenge is illegal deforestation, what is linked with putting value in this ecosystems arena. So that's something that we have to do better. But also energy, we're very clean. We have almost 90% on electricity metrics renewable. We have around 50% on the energy metrics renewable. So we are already what the world wants to be in 2040 maybe. But the challenge is to keep that ambition very high and to use that clean area to the three metrics to really to stimulate new industrialization. So green hydrogen and things like that. That's something that we need to shift from this new industrialization, because from now that's not happening.
Thank you, Marina. And Claire, you know what it's like to be a minister and have to get elected, face all the criticism. Whatever you do, it seems to me it's kind of a rule of politics that whatever you do, 90% of the people will, or 90% of the stuff you hear will be hate. Really tough job. And now you're very much working with the business community at WBCSD. So I remember actually when Alex Sharma in the run up to COP26 gathered a group of business CEOs, got them all to introduce themselves. They all told him about the great stuff they were doing, and then he asked them how he could help them, and they just sort of all stopped and said, no, we're here to help you. How can we help you? And at that he was kind of stopped in his tracks by that. And the general perception is that business only really talks to policymakers when they want something from them. So tell us a little bit from your experience of both sides of knowing both those communities really well. How can businesses help governments, and maybe how should governments be thinking about getting that help rather than assuming that business will always want to just extract?
I think it's really important. I think that dynamic is changing. I just want to take 1 minute though to come back on this transparency point, because I think there is this question about, the beauty of the Paris Agreement was that it gave countries the ability to set their development plans, common and differentiated responsibilities starting from different points. And NDCs work best if they are a real version of the truth, where you are and where you plan to be. And of course, NDCs for countries do not include scope 3 emissions by design, which means that fossil fuel intensive economies who are exporting the majority of their fossil fuel production don't count those emissions by design in their NDCs. What has happened is that we have applied opinion as well as fact to NDC. So, for example, Brazil has Petrobras. Brazil produces far more oil and gas than Azerbaijan, and Brazil is planning 100 billion increase in its Petrobras overall capex budget over the next 5 years, of which 10% is going into non-fossil fuel production. UAE, the same, right? UAE is planning to expand for fossil fuels. UAE's NDC last year was one of the most detailed, sectoral, bottom-up, inclusive NDCs I think the world has ever seen. And it's rated critically insufficient by those who rate these things because it plans to expand its oil and gas exports. This has nothing to do with NDC methodology. So my kind of plea to the world is, if you really want countries to be honest about their development trajectories, don't either change the methodology so that scope 3 production, oil and gas emissions from production is included, or stop the ideological assassination, because all that does is mean that people don't tell the truth. And then you end up in a COP situation where those NDCs are neither good for assessing where the world is, and they are not good for implementation documents. That said, I'll come to the point. So I think this conversation now about how businesses and governments work together has changed crucially. And actually, In a world where regulatory certainty around decarbonisation now feels like it's a little, that's an ambition rather than actually what will happen over the next 5 years, it's ever more important that businesses absolutely show that they're committed to their own net zero pathways and then say to government, what are the things that they need to deliver? And historically, it's been a begging bowl. Look, we just want you to get rid of all regulation and give us a ton of money and we'll go away and deliver. But that is not also reality. If you can be very specific. So, for example, we did a thing in the UK called the offshore wind sector deal, which I led, where we said we want to increase our offshore wind production by 10x. This is our UK's renewable superpower. We want some of that manufacturing onshore. I wanted the workforce to be more diverse. How do we co-create that plan together? And it was exceptional because we worked out that actually what we needed was the UK auction process to be far more long-term. We needed to give businesses a 10-year view of demand certainty, not price, but volume. We were then able to talk about where would we like manufacturing to be, what incentives do you need to onshore manufacture. So it is absolutely possible to have those conversations. And I know sometimes the world can feel a bit hopeless. I was very inspired earlier this week when the Indonesian delegation came over to the Green Zone, to the McKinsey Pavilion, and they said, we have this plan. Here is our government. Here are our ministers. Here is our energy sector. Here are our heavy emitters. Here are our innovators. We're all here. We all get it. We're all talking. And I don't think I've seen any other government, including the UK, actually do that whole of economy approach. And it was really heartening. So I guess I'd like that to be expressed in a realistic NDC, but there are definitely countries who are working out that this public-private, almost mutual reinforcement is absolutely the way to go.
Wonderful, thank you, Claire. Really, really good example. I'm gonna look out for the Indonesian model. Okay, we're very close to the end of the time for Q&A, so I'm not going to ask you another detailed question. I just want you to, in a very pithy remark, imagine that you're addressing a group of ministers who are responsible for producing the next NDC, and you're going to give them one piece of advice which is going to help them make sure that it meets Simon Steele's ABC criteria, that it's ambitious, that it's broken down by sector and gases, and that it's credible. So from your own perspective, pithy, powerful, and advice to the minister.
Well, the advice to the minister that we gave to Brazil, which was taken, and now we give it to all other countries, use our data.
Great.
Right? So our data is being used by the Brazilian government, it's feeding into their NDCs. It's giving them the data on what the companies are doing, what their targets are, as you were talking about, Claire, what they want to invest in, where the barriers are, where the risks are, where the opportunities are, and that is feeding into their whole of economy NDC. Use the data.
Great, thank you, Nikki. And that's a very big and very rich and now very, very long data set over 24 years. Great, thank you. Sergio.
So standards.
Okay.
The UN Secretary General this morning referred to the need of a standard on net zero.
Yeah.
So let's participate in the creation of that standard that we hope to deliver next year in Belém.
Great, thank you. Alina.
Yeah, we are in the implementation years. So that's all about. I think the COPs are changing now from negotiation to implementation really quickly. So my advice will be just here, private sector, but not only the private sector, but the society, and work together, as Claire was saying. That's the point, because we have to do something that's tangible, that can be really transparent, and that people can really feel that that's a new developing plan for the whole country.
I would first say to my business, are you members of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which is the world's most long-serving and I think the most impressive business-led sustainability NGO with wonderful local chapters. But I would say you have to stand up on television now and defend this thing, this NDC, this anachronistic thing that people would like to use. Tell it like it is. What is this? Why is this important? How is it applicable for everybody who is part of this society? And, ministers get really uncomfortable when they have to boil things down to very simple messages. But ultimately, if this is truly the transformation plan, then it needs to have a message in there for everybody. And it also needs to be a listening exercise. What does the government need to do to provide the long-term stability? So it's broadcast and listen.
Great, thank you. Wonderful panel. I think we're learning how to do these things better. Very clear that there are some really powerful tools, and we've got some of them represented here, whether it's rich data sets or profoundly collaborative ways of arriving at standards available to ministers, and that there's a need to find ways to engage. We have business here. There are other important stakeholders, and Claire, to your point, to make NDCs become whole of economy development statements or growth plans. You can use different language and not think of them as a narrow UNFCCC compliance instrument, but a way into thinking about how to engage the whole of society in tackling the problem whilst driving economic growth. So thank you hugely to a wonderful panel. Let's hear it for all of them. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Mike to hold some Q&A. So the panel could stay up, and then Mike, just come swap with me, and then I think we've got plenty of time for Q&A, not a rushed one like the last time. But apologies, I have to head off. So thank you.
Somebody has to work.
Yes.
Cool. Hello, everyone again. So I think we've got 10 or so minutes for any questions to our audience.
Nigel.
Reminder to introduce yourself before you ask your question and who you want to ask it to, or a general question. So any questions? None? Yep. Okay.
Thank you. I do believe that carbon market is an essential tool to actually motivate, especially private business, into decarbonizing and going net zero faster. Because when you put a price on things, business react quite fast. Now, of course, a carbon credit with unverified data comes down to printing currency, right? So you need standards and certifiable standards. So my question is how to convey that message to the regulators. Thank you.
Okay, so who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to have a pop. So I chair the board of the CIX, the Climate Impact X in Singapore, and set up the voluntary carbon market task force when I had set the COP26 agenda. And I think your point is absolutely correct. You know, we talk a lot about, wouldn't it be great if we had a global carbon price? There will never be a regulated global carbon price. It is just inconceivable. Although I do think actually the G20 could have a floor price. And this is one of the things I think people are sort of vaguely hoping they might get out of next year's COP, is some sense of what is the minimum price for a nature-based credit in Brazil, which would be extremely helpful. And so I think you're right. I think carbon markets are a way of providing that data transparency and actually driving action. And they clearly need standards. And I know ISO has been involved in some of those conversations about carbon standards. We have lots of standards emerging, and we have done a lot of work on integrity of supply, on verification of supply, on integrity of buyers and usage. I think we need to make some decisions rather than keep reinventing standards. And I was quite heartened by the Article 6 discussion or decision that came through, which is we're starting to close in on a collection of standards. And I think what's next to happen, frankly, is governments with their allowance markets to be clearer about which standards they will accept. Because I think the allowance and project markets will and should converge quite rapidly. And then the other thing I'll say, and it's back to the amazing presentation, you know, we have neglected to invest in land-based solutions, even with all the uncertainty, for too long, and we have not seen funds flow to critical parts of the world that could use that money for too long. So I think we need to just give ourselves a bit of confidence that there aren't really that many bad actors left in this system. There are people who are just confused and need some clarity, but there is a lot of funding that can flow once we've got some confidence and certainty.
Cool, thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
No, perhaps I can build on that and also answer Nigel's question before he escaped. He asked me how can international standards drive policy? And there is a no and a yes in my answer. The no is that we do not make policy. That's the job of policymakers and regulators. We support them in the implementation of those policies. That is the no part. But the yes part is that technical regulations made by policymakers need to be based on international standards, at least in the side of international trade. The World Trade Organization, through the TBT agreement, has said with all clarity, those technical regulations shall be, not would be nice if not, shall be based on international standards. And the beauty of that is that they can take international standards and incorporate them into regulation. And that way, if they are incorporating regulation internationally agree best practice, we can achieve a better level of harmonization. I'm sure that that helps.
All right, thank you.
Sorry to build on that, but if I just wanted to, again, position sort of some of the business organizations, which is that, you know, when we had TCFD, which was a disclosure standard, you know, this was a voluntary standard that was developed by a collection of businesses and banks coming together, and now it has turned into a regulated standard. And Nigel talks about it being difficult to agree things as ministers. It's even more difficult across cross-border ministerial discussions, sometimes using voluntary associations, using WBCSD, who are one of the delivery partners for TCFD, as a way of getting some very powerful entities to agree to use and be judged by standards, and then it almost smooths the pathway for regulatory certainty down the line.
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, one more question here.
Hi, Greg Bryner from the Women Business Coalition. Mike made a compelling case at the beginning that CO2 removals by forests are not a substitute for fossil emissions. And I'm curious to know, a lot of the targets that are being put forward are for net emissions, with the emissions from other sectors plus the land use sector. Is it your view that it would be useful and useful for investors and others to be clear as to how much of the target is expected to come from gross emissions from other sectors, and have separate targets for the land use sector? Or actually, is it useful to keep that flexibility in terms of not being specific? So I guess more generally, how useful is it to have sector specific targets for your main target broken down into sector, and specifically on the land use? Is that useful, or actually is it useful to keep that flexibility? Thanks.
Okay, who wants to answer that one?
I think we, again, as we develop funds flows into removals and we develop removals products, we should just have radical transparency. So, I mean, we should, I mean, it seems to me to be obvious as a corporate that you should, or actually as a country, because we're talking about ITMOs with very little reporting requirements for them, right? They're just kind of going into net zero strategy. That's the country to country transferable obligations. Why not just have radical below the line disclosure? So here's our mitigation actions, and here's what we've done in terms of removal, either insetting or offsetting. And here's what we've been sold or think we've bought in terms of tons of CO2 and assurances over duration. And then it's there, and then the data's there. And then when you have an argument about, well, look, that land sink we've had a wildfire, you know, then it's much easier to actually have. And again, I truly think, in fact, there's very good data that says that companies who engage in offsetting are decarbonizing twice as quickly as those who are not, and are much more likely to report their emissions data. This notion that if you buy a removal, you're suddenly going to stop reducing is fallacious. MSCI did the data a couple of months ago. But I think we don't believe it until we see it. So having radical transparency, and again, then it shows us if we have got challenges, particularly to our geomorphic land sinks as opposed to the subsurface sinks, you're able to see it. And just as an accountant would look at a company's balance or P&L or balance sheet to see their risks, those risks of using climate offsets are very visible to the world. So I would be all for radical transparency in the removal space. And I think California is the first jurisdiction who's actually requiring that. Requiring disclosure of removals, but to me it just seems obvious as something you would do voluntarily.
I totally agree. I think that's important part of the strategy of any company. So that's, you have to combine those components with also the mitigation and by technology and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a parallel in the corporate world, right, where everything is based on standards. I completely agree. And underneath all, like, we hear a lot about the reporting standards, we hear a lot about the ISSB. We are fully aligned with S2. So this year was like the first S2 data sets in the world, right? We're very, very aligned with EFRAG and also with other TNFD and other standards. And we embed ISO, we embed the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. But the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the one that's needing to be updated now, right? Because measuring these things, so many approaches, right? There are so many approaches to doing that. Unless you actually get into the weeds on the detail on standards, you're going to end up with different numbers. So then if you think about the corporate inventory, right, let's think about it as a parallel to countries. I think radical transparency is the key, but also standardization of the approach, making sure companies driving towards prioritization, right? So that they're measuring and focusing on the places that matter for that sector, and making sure that they have a separate ledger system. In other words, all of my mitigation, my emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, a separate accounting for any of removals or beyond value chain, whatever you want to call it, right? Any finance flows you have used, market mechanisms to drive change within your value chain or outside of your value chain should be a separate level of accounting or in a separate space, so that in a similar way to countries where the Greenhouse Gas Protocol goes with this. But I think that's really, really important. If we don't have that radical transparency, you can't just make 1 + 1 = 3.
Yeah. And we can also do, just very short, we can also do better on this because I think enhanced strategic partnership among standard makers is also needed. There is too much out there, sometimes conflicting, fragmented, and we should combine our talents on this one.
Cool. Thank you. So we've run out of time for questions, but if you want to ask any at the end, I'm sure the people will be here to answer them. So before we finish, one final comment from everyone, just on looking forward now at COP30, what would everyone like to see? Short, very quick, please. We'll just get down the panel.
I want to see what we achieve on finance here to be achieved and to be linked to quite granularly to the adaptation conversation at COP. Those two things. So the transition itself and transition finance shouldn't just be focused on mitigation. I'd really like to see that become as granular and as focused on the adaptation side of things. And I think Brazil can really lead the charge on that.
An invitation and a dream. First, the invitation is ownership. Everyone in this room can be a standard maker through your national standard body in your respective country. And then the dream, we can launch next year in Belém our net zero standard as requested by the UN Secretary General.
Make invitation to all of you, go to Belém, go to Brazil, but also work hard here to have the finance done, some of the finance done, because that's a very important step before Belém.
So I have a hope, which is, so COP is, we have a, what are we, COP? Where are we now? COP 29. We have 20, they all blur. They don't, some of them great, but we have 29 years of initiatives. Right, so I mean, last year we had great focus on methane in the oil and gas sector. We had a new funding pool in Altera that was exclusively targeting blended finance opportunities in the global south. I just would love to see every COP president look at all the stuff that's gone before and try and make sure it's delivered. I know from experience, there's a great temptation to say, no, by the way, when you become the COP president, or at least this was my experience, nobody gives you the playbook. You kind of sit and make it up. It's quite shocking. And actually what you want to do is say, gosh, some of these things are really powerful and we need to deliver them. Otherwise their credibility runs out. So my hope would be that the good stuff we've done so far, we continue to do. You continue to hold those pledges to account. My wish is I would love to see some form of floor price for nature. It is incredible to me that you can buy a nature-based credit for 30 cents or you can buy one for $200. This is not a market that is working well. And I think Brazil has the capability as the custodian of such an important ecosystem to be very clear about what it expects that to be worth in the world. That would be a huge breakthrough.
Cool. Cool. Thank you. So let's thank our speakers again and we'll wrap up there.
Thanks for that terrible report.
There you go. each year, isn't it?